Jaya Sri Caitanya Jaya Nityananda Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jaya Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. So I'm going to start with Sri Caitanya Caritamrita Adi Lila chapter 7 verse 124. But we'll do the call and response on verse 127, which is the one that's up here, because that one has a purport. Avichincha Shakti Yukta Sri Bhagavan Ichaya Jagad Rupe Paya Parinam. Oh, it's a good. Yeah. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is opulent in all respects, therefore by his inconceivable energies he has transformed the material cosmic manifestation. Text 125. Tatapi achintya shakti hoya avikari prakrita chintamanita he drishtanta ye dhari. Using the example of a touchstone, which by its energy turns iron into gold and yet remains the same, we can understand that although the Supreme Personality of Godhead transforms his innumerable energies, he remains unchanged. Nanaratna Roshi Hoya Chintamani Hoite Tatapiha Manirahe Swarupe Abhikrite. Although touchstone produces many varieties of valuable jewels, it nevertheless remains the same. It does not change its original form. Which brings us to text 127. Prakrita Vishtute Jadi Achintya Shakti Hoya Iswarera Achintya Shakti Ite Ki Vismai. Prakrita Vastute Adi Achintya Shakti Hoy Ishware Achintya Shakti Ite Kai Vismai. Prakrita Vastute, in material things. Jadi, if. Achintya, inconceivable. Shakti, potency. Hoya, becomes possible. Iswarera, of the Supreme Lord. Achintya, inconceivable. Shakti, potency. Ite, in this. Ki, what? Vismai, wonderful. Translation. If there is such inconceivable potency in material objects, why should we not believe in the inconceivable potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Please repeat. If there is such inconceivable potency in material objects, why should we not believe in the inconceivable potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead? Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The argument of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu described in this verse can be very easily understood even by a common man if he simply thinks of the activities of the sun, which has been giving off unlimited amounts of heat and light since time immemorial, and yet has not even slightly decreased in power. Modern science believes that it is by sunshine that the entire cosmic manifestation is maintained, and actually one can see how the actions and reactions of sunshine maintain order throughout the universe. The growth of vegetables and even the rotation of the planets take place due to the heat and light of the sun. Sometimes, therefore, modern scientists consider the sun to be the original cause of creation, not knowing that the sun is only a medium, for it is also created by the supreme energy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Aside from the sun and touchstone, there are many other material things which transform their energy in different ways, and yet remain as they are. It is not necessary, therefore, for the original cause, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, to change, due to the changes or transformations of his different energies. The falsity of Sripad Shankaracharya's explanation of Vivartavad and Parinamvad has been detected by the Vaishnavacharyas, especially Jiva Goswami, whose opinion is that actually Shankara did not understand the Vedanta Sutra. In Shankara's explanation of one sutra, Anandamayobhyasat, he has interpreted the affix mayat with such word jugglery that this very explanation proves that he had little knowledge of the Vedanta Sutra, but simply wanted to support his impersonalism through the codes of the Vedanta philosophy. Actually, however, he failed to do so because he could not put forward strong arguments. In this connection, Srila Jiva Goswami cites the code Brahma Pucham Pratishtha, which gives Vedic evidence that Brahman is the origin of everything. In explaining this verse, Sripad Shankaracharya interpreted various Sanskrit words in such a way that he implied, according to Jiva Goswami, that Vyasadeva had very little knowledge of higher logic. Such unscrupulous deviation from the real meaning of the Vedanta Sutra has created a class of men who, by word jugglery, try to derive various indirect meanings from the Vedic literatures, especially Bhagavad Gita. One of them has even explained that the word Kurukshetra refers to the body. Such interpretations imply, however, that neither Lord Krishna nor Vyasadeva had a proper sense of word usage or etymological adjustment. They lead one to assume that since Lord Krishna could not personally sense the meaning of what he was speaking, and Vyasadeva did not know the meaning of what he was writing, Lord Krishna left his book to be explained later by the Mayavadis. Such interpretations merely prove, however, that their proponents have very little philosophical sense. Instead of wasting one's time falsely deriving such indirect meanings from Vedanta Sutra and other Vedic literatures, one should accept the words of these books as they are. In presenting Bhagavad Gita as it is, therefore, we have not changed the meaning of the original words. Similarly, if one studies Vedanta Sutra as it is, without whimsical and capricious adulteration, one can understand the Vedanta Sutra very easily. Srila Vyasadeva therefore explains Vedanta Sutra beginning from the first sutra, Janmad Yasya Yataha, in his Srimad Bhagavatam. Janmad Yasya Yaton Vayad Itaratas Chaches Vabhigya Swarat. I meditate upon him, Lord Sri Krishna, the transcendent reality, who is the primeval cause of all causes, from whom all manifested universes arrive, in whom they dwell, and by whom they are destroyed. I meditate upon the eternally effulgent Lord, who is directly and indirectly conscious of all manifestations, and yet is fully independent. The Supreme Personality of Godhead knows very well how to do everything perfectly. He is abhigya, always fully conscious. The Lord therefore says in Bhagavad Gita 7:26 that he knows everything, past, present and future, but no one but a devotee knows him as he is. Therefore the absolute truth, the personality of Godhead, is at least partially understood by the devotees of the Lord. But the Mayavadi philosophers, who unnecessarily speculate to understand the absolute truth, simply waste their time. Srila Prabhupada ki Om Jnana Timarandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chaksuram Meditam Jaina Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkest ignorance, but my spiritual master has kindly forced open my eyes with the scalpel of knowledge. I therefore offer my respectful obeisances unto him. You can actually hear Srila Prabhupada's irritation in this purport with the Mayavadis. Srila Prabhupada was very composed, but if there was anything that really got his transcendental anger awakened, it was Mayavadi philosophy. Actually, at one point it almost wrecked ISKCON. There were some devotees preaching that Prabhupada is God. Prabhupada was about to pack up and leave and just go back to India and give up the whole business. Sometimes he would say, I kick on their face with boots. Others may not understand why we'd have such a big issue. Aren't you supposed to be transcendentalist? Aren't you supposed to be peaceful and, walking on clouds and so on? But actually, if something is against personalism, if it's something is against recognizing or acknowledging Krishna as a person, actually it's the most sinful thing. Sinful is an interesting word because typically we might think of some harsh judgment coming from someone on a cloud throwing thunderbolts around. But sin just means apart. It just means when something is separate. That doesn't justify sins, but it's simply meaning that the word, the connotations in our mind may have come through a certain cultural lens. It just means apart. It keeps us apart from God. So we pray every day, many times, Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatadeshatani. That Srila Prabhupada's mission is described as ending the nirvishesha, the undifferentiated monism, and shunyavadi, the voidism that is especially prevalent in the Western countries, Paschatya Desh. This is a wonderful verse. In many ways it mirrors some of the very simple arguments that Srila Prabhupada would give in Life Comes from Life. Actually, truth is something that is very simple. Or at least when someone understands truth, they can articulate it in such a simple way. And it's incontrovertible, it's irrefutable. The scientists would claim, yes, life came from chemicals. It's just some kind of interaction of material chemicals. So Srila Prabhupada, having a scientific background, would simply say, please demonstrate. That's what you claim that you are about. You claim not to teach things which are not falsifiable. You claim to teach only those things which you have verified through experimentation, through observation. Have you seen this? Can you make life from chemicals? Then maybe hold your tongue. Anyway, Srila Prabhupada would get very, very animated when he was taking on the scientist. And the scientist and the Mayavadis more or less came to the same conclusion, that this is just an accident, this is not real, there's no person to whom we're accountable. And actually that's the basis of materialism. So how can the cause be less than the effects? If the effects in this world are full of variety, full of people, full of emotion, then how did that come from something that had none of those characteristics? The scientists would argue, yes, something blew up. As if this is really any kind of explanation at all. You can see how weak the logic is. They will decry, yes, this God idea is circular reasoning. You need to have some kind of dogmatic faith in a creator. But we ask you to have dogmatic faith in an explosion. We don't know what exploded, we don't know why it exploded, we don't know what existed prior to the explosion, but that's a better explanation than God. Even though your experience in this world is explosions lead to chaos and disintegration, this explosion led to order. It's a phantasmagoria. It's completely, again, did they witness it? Can they reproduce it? Then what are they teaching? Simply nonsense. Srila Prabhupada would constantly call the scientists bluff. And it's very important to challenge these notions because these atheistic understandings are what have given rise to moral relativism. Anything then becomes okay if you can rationalize it in some ways. There's no absolute sense of being accountable to someone who prescribes right and wrong. But it's just whatever you can argue. So we can see that that's leading to a rapid degradation. I remember even from witnessing from my childhood, and this is an example I've been giving for decades, I can see moral decline right in front of my eyes. I can see the language that people is using is becoming rougher. You can see that people are more and more prone to squabble. Nowadays, access to sin, and also without any, with impunity, without any shame, is ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. Nowadays, the kind of things that are going on, aided by science to facilitate sense gratification, whether that's cloning embryos for spare parts, or even using the byproducts of terminated fetuses. These are unimaginable things. But if you have no ultimate sense of right and wrong, if there is no creator, if we're not accountable to anybody, then right and wrong are just very old ideas based on these superstitions of religious people. And we're so much advanced now that we're able to do anything without shame. It's truly horrible. So the Mayavadis describe the cause of all causes being undifferentiated monism. But this doesn't account for why would it change then? And why are they so busy telling us about it? Who do they believe they're talking to if we're all one? Like, I'm supposedly an unconvinced spark of the same flame? What? If I don't really exist, why are you trying to convince me of anything? Actually, the only Mayavadi with integrity has to be quiet. But the fact is they're always in a flap trying to explain their superior knowledge because they don't even buy into their own worldview. Crazy. I mean, it's understandable why people were frustrated with religion. This is called the age of quarrel. That we can see very readily, speeding up, actually going completely nuclear now. But it's also called the age of hypocrisy. So just as the scientists will espouse a theory that they actually don't themselves believe in, or in other words, they will claim you religionists have to meet a certain basis of evidence for us to accept your claims. On the other hand, you should accept our claims, even though we can't verify them. But why did people reject religion? Well, let's face it. It's full of hypocrisy. It's often obtuse and dull, irrelevant, suppressive, offering very few satisfactory answers, and dogmatic. We can see that Srila Prabhupada actually infused life into ancient teachings. People had still been around the Vedas for some time, but it didn't create this explosion of the Krishna consciousness movement. And Srila Prabhupada would say, one who has life can preach. And this is very important when it comes to this idea that also comes through in the purport of faithful representation. So it's hardly surprising that people were so anxious to get rid of religion that they were quite happy to jump onto any superficially credible idea. Oh, we evolved. There was an initial abiogenesis. Somehow the chemicals, the amino acids became life. The universe exploded. These aren't satisfactory explanations at all. Anyone with the modicum of intelligence would apply a little critical thinking, go, you haven't explained origins. You didn't explain how life came from nothing. You didn't really explain what it was that blew up. But people are so happy to have an alternative to God. No accountability. No sense of restriction on sense gratification. But they just took these things up very easily. In the Padma Purana, 236.5 through 12, I'm not sure exactly how to break that down. Maybe there's a canto 6 and a chapter 236 and verses 5 through 12. We study only the spotless Purana, really, but sometimes Srila Prabhupada would quote from these other Shastras. Lord Shiva explains to Parvati that he will appear in the age of Kali to proclaim that the Buddha's doctrine is a false doctrine and illusory. In other words, he predicted, I will come as Sankaracharya. So Shankara is mentioned here. Srila Prabhupada doesn't really spare him any punches. It says, he may have commented on Vedanta Sutra, but he didn't really understand Vedanta Sutra. It's just word jugglery. And actually Lord Shiva described that this is exactly what his business was. At the outset of the age of Kali, the Brahminical class became corrupted. And one of the first parts of that corruption was sacrifices where they would previously rejuvenate the life of the sacrificed animal, whether that be a cow or a horse, simply by chanting mantras. An old cow would go into the fire and a young calf would come out of the fire. Just by virtue of the Brahmatejas, the Shakti of that Brahmana, such potency in chanting the mantras. If you haven't noticed, people don't have that kind of potency anymore. Srila Prabhupada said it may come. A few generations, we may have kids in our movement who can light the sacrificial fire by mantra. So far, we're not seeing that, but it may come. Srila Prabhupada did suggest it may be several generations. But one of the ways in which the Brahmins began to abuse is that they would eat those sacrificial animals. Eating the flesh of a cow. It's horrible even to say it here in the temple room, but these things are going on. And this was such a corruption of the Vedic path that Krishna's first strategy was to lead people away from the Vedas. He came as Buddha, Keshavadrita Buddha Sharira Jai Jagadisha Hare, and led people away from the Vedas, teaching very simple principles like ahimsa, non-violence. And quite an impersonalist doctrine, actually, a voidist doctrine. Nothing exists. We have to somehow realize that everything is shunya, everything is zero. And this was step one in a sequence. Shankaracharya was the next step in the sequence, who more or less taught the same ideas, but showed that it was actually there in the Vedas, and led people back to the Vedas now that the ahimsa was more prevalent. And in fact, that's where Buddhism was more or less driven out of India. There's still a few pockets in India, but you'll actually find that Buddhism then spread across Asia. And it was adopted by various kings. So Shankara became the most prominent. In fact, even now, it's perhaps one of the most prominent schools of Indian philosophical thought. Now the Shankaracharya, a little bit like the Dalai Lama, is a role that keeps reproducing. There's always going to be a Shankaracharya somewhere on the planet. But Lord Shiva was Adi Shankara. He was the very first of these. And then the Vaishnavacharyas came, Vishnu Swami, Nimbaka, Ramanuja, Madhva, all paving the way for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. They all taught various forms, like Vishnu Swami taught something, sounded almost like monism, but there was something slightly different. Then it comes all the way through to Madhva, who was absolute about the dualism. In fact, when you see pictures of Madhvacharya, he's holding two. You and God are different. And then Lord Chaitanya came to reconcile all of this with the philosophy Achincha, Beda, Vedata. The same word is used here, Achincha. It's inconceivable. Actually, the word to conceive we typically use when we talk about a child coming into the world. It means to put inside a container. So you can't conceive of something that's unlimited. You can't put it inside a box. Our minds will never be able to get ourselves around something that's inconceivable. So it's an interesting play on words there from the Latin. Shankara said he would propound the Mayavada or impersonalist philosophy, emphasizing the undefinable nature of the Brahman, the great impersonal spiritual force. He explained the philosophy of Maya, Mayavadi, is a wicked doctrine and is pseudo-Buddhist. In the form of a Brahmin, I shall proclaim this doctrine in Kali Yuga. It makes the words of the holy Vedic text meaningless and is condemned in the world. In this doctrine, it recommends giving up one's duties of life in order to be free of karma, which is said to be religiousness for those who have fallen from their duties. I will propound the identity of the Supreme Soul and the individual soul to be one and the same, Brahman in nature, without qualities. O Goddess, I have conceived this Mayavad impersonalist doctrine, which resembles a purport of the Vedas, for deluding people in the age of Kali, to mislead them towards atheism by denying the personal form of God. In one place it's actually described, I've come to accelerate Kali Yuga. Because if you think about it, the atheistic doctrines, the impersonalist doctrines, the rationalist scientific paradigm, this is what enables unbridled sense gratification, no restraint. These ideas of restraint and morality are seemingly leftover ideas from that perspective. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya said, Mayavadi Basya Shunile Hoy Savanash. If you hear Mayavadi philosophy, everything will be destroyed. So we should be particularly careful about who we hear from, as learning false conclusions can be injurious to the development of one's bhakti. If one with bhakti, whose character and practice is ideal, whose motives are clean, who is faithfully representing the parampara, repeating what they have heard and understood from authorized sources, this fosters the right understanding, inspires shraddha, awakens devotional sentiments. Upadekshanti te jnanam, jnaninas tattvadashina. A tattvadashi, one who's directly perceived the truth, they alone can initiate others into knowledge and not otherwise. Shabde parichanishnatam brahmani upashramashrayam. Elsewhere it's described what should you look for in a spiritual teacher. Shabde parichanishnatam, they must have realized the conclusions of Shastra so well that they can explain them in a way that will alleviate all doubt. In the purport, Hridayananda Maharaj, presumably in the same way Srila Prabhupada did, consulting the previous Acharya's commentaries, said if a spiritual master cannot alleviate the doubts of the disciple, then the disciple in due course becomes discouraged and perhaps gives up Krishna consciousness. And Brahmani Upasramashrayam, who's also steadily fixed on the platform of spirituality. So nowadays it's fashionable and even appealing for people to set themselves up as spiritual authorities in order to acquire gullible followers. There are all kinds of sense gratification. Some people just watch TV all day. That's a very lazy form of sense gratification. Other people may try to conquer the world. You know, Alexander the Great would try to build the biggest empire ever. Different form of sense gratification. A more subtle form is the idea of being deeply spiritual and acquiring loads of adoring followers. This is a very, very dangerous, and we were just referring now, Nadanam, Najanam, Nasundarim. I don't want this janam, says Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I don't want lots of followers. This is a trap of Maya. So people, trying to be distinctive and having their own unique spiritual path, pass on ideas that they've manufactured rather than acquired via careful and attentive listening to bona fide authorities and through inquiry and service and surrender. They foolishly and arrogantly consider their own speculations to be on an equal footing with the revealed truth from Shastra and realized souls. This is why Srila Prabhupada emphasized the daily study of Shastra, reading his commentaries, hearing from realized souls. Nowadays we witness people in general developing a perverse relationship with Prabhupada's Vani. They begin with a pre-existing idea of what they believe, and they look it up in the database and see if they can find something where Prabhupada appears to be backing them up. It's completely upside down way of understanding. First we should, in fact this word tadvidhi pranipatena, nipatya, means blank slate. One should not consider that one knows anything when approaching the bona fide spiritual master. To be surrendered means considering oneself a fool in front of the spiritual master. Whereas if one considers, I already know something, let's see if Prabhupada agrees with me. This is where so many unfortunate ideas prevail. If you understand Srila Prabhupada's body of work as a whole, you wouldn't come to errant conclusions. But this takes daily engagement. Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. In this way, all kinds of ideas become popularized that have no fundamental basis in Gaudiya Siddhanta. Personally, I worry sometimes for the integrity of Prabhupada's teachings being properly preserved and passed on to future generations, since relatively few nowadays seem to acquire their understanding by disciplined study of the teachings of the Acharyas from bona fide sources, rather than just imbibing and teaching some hodgepodge acquired from social media. It seems like people are less and less discriminating. One of the symptoms of people in this age is to be misled, misguided. What is that verse? Prayanal payusa sabya karavasmini gejana manda sumanda matayo manda bhagya. So unfortunate. Hupradrutaha. Always disturbed. So Srila Prabhupada often quoted from Bhagavad Gita, Evam parampara praptam imang rajrishayo vidu sa kaleneha mahata yogo nashta parantapa. It's quite a heavy verse. Essentially, Krishna is telling Arjuna, I passed this down in the past. This isn't the first time someone's getting these teachings. The problem was that although it was passed down from one king to another, to another, to another, parampara means one after the other, due to the influence of time, it's very interesting that that's the attribution. Due to the influence of time, the message got changed, and therefore yoga nashta, the connection was broken. The connection, nashta actually means destroyed. That connection was destroyed because, and this is what we see, particularly in time. In fact, this is one of the ways that we know the scientists are wrong. There is a hypothesis the scientists have, I think they call it the third law of thermodynamics, entropy. Everything breaks down over course. So instead of a world becoming more complex, actually it should become more and more simple. Well, that's not what's happening. But entropy certainly exists when it comes to spiritual teachings. If one person's listening to Srila Prabhupada and he picks up about 75% accurate message, and then he passes it on, and the person listening picks up maybe 75% of that accurate message, over time it's getting more and more diluted. And this is why Srila Prabhupada stressed the reading of his books. We also are very fortunate to have lots of recordings of Srila Prabhupada speaking. So we need to be particularly careful. The Sankirtan movement has been undone through Kali's mischief on several occasions before. After Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu, within a couple of generations, we had Shyamananda Prabhu, Srinivasacharya, Narottam Das Thakur. Actually, the movement was very vibrant. The preaching was prolific throughout India. And then within a generation or two, all the Apta Sampradayas sort of took over. Gaudiya Vaishnavism became quite disrespected. And it was only a few individual acharyas, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Srila Baladeva Jibhushana, who kept those original teachings unmutilated. And Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur reintroduced. His son, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, again got a global movement. Actually, you could say Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had a global movement. He sent people to Germany, sent people to the UK. It just didn't take off like it did under his disciple eventually, Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. But we also saw Gaudiya Math splinter and fracture. And Srila Prabhupada didn't mince his words about the disobedience of some of those disciples. So we shouldn't think that this can't happen to ISKCON. We shouldn't think that the scale of ISKCON is necessarily indicative of its health and well-being. Its health and well-being is purely down to faithful representation of what Srila Prabhupada gave us. So we need to commit to the discipline of speech to only pass on that which we know to be true. Not to be like the Mayavadis, not to be like the scientists, inventing all kinds of nonsense because it sounds good or it gets followers. We should be very committed to ensuring that we're picking up the right understanding and passing that on. So choosing who we listen to and thus assign authority to, daily immersion in Prabhupada's writings, recordings, prioritizing the imbibing of Divya Gyan, and eliminating or reducing hearing other subject matters altogether. Really paying attention, concentrating without distraction, thinking about what we're hearing or reading, retaining it, practicing faithfully representing it, and maintaining a perpetual spirit of inquiry. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki. So perhaps there's time for other comments or questions. You have to speak up a little bit for me, please.
Towards the end of the class, you were talking about only presenting exactly what Prabhupada has presented. And to have faith in that is very important too, because you can say exactly what Prabhupada has presented to us, but someone might just walk away and not appear to accept it. But sometime later, there's every possibility it will sink in. Don't just make that comment.
Thank you. Yeah, when we get attached to the results and we go, I must see a result from my preaching to feel good about my preaching. Krishna warns about attachment to the fruits all the time. And that's when we start to meddle and alter. Now the fact is, Srila Prabhupada said, put it in your own words. But put it in your own words. In other words, the truth is what it is. So if we're just inventing ideas, that's not putting it in our own words. And I've noticed more and more people in recent years find some passages of Prabhupada's writings or speakings to be a little difficult for them to be able to explain to the satisfaction of other people. And if they're overly attached, rather than confessing, I need to contemplate more how to properly represent Prabhupada, they distance themselves from Prabhupada. Oh yes, Srila Prabhupada was raised in Calcutta, Victorian times. Some of that's crept in. Very, very dangerous. To me, that's tantamount to calling the spiritual master an ordinary man, saying he was socially conditioned. He couldn't distinguish in himself from Vedic revealed truths and, customs. It's a very, very dangerous line of thought. But if we're too attached and we need to seem like a successful preacher, then we might be tempted to meddle, say things that sound more pleasing to the ear. Srila Prabhupada gave us a perfect example in his poem when he arrived at Boston Harbor. He said, I can simply repeat your message. It's up to you to make my power of speaking suitable for their understanding. Only by your mercy can my words become pure. So he would often say, whatever success I have is that I simply repeated my spiritual master's message without adulteration. The lawyer who registered ISKCON, when he read some of the clauses in the articles of memorandum about the four regulative principles, he was, Swamiji, maybe you could relent a little here. I mean, this is America. If you want to be popular, that's maybe the price you have to pay. We will not change Krishna consciousness to suit the Americans. So we have to be mindful of that. If we're trying to suit the preferences of souls at any point in history, then once we start meddling with the secret source, the scary thing is, after a while, you actually forfeit the ability to know where the line is anymore. Once you've crossed that line often enough, you've muddied it, it's blurred, then you actually lose the ability. And this is where we start to fall in love with our own mental speculation, as opposed to being a faithful follower. There was a devotee who went to Germany just before the devotees went to the UK. I think his name was Jivananda. Might have been Shivananda. Right. And he had some write-up in the newspaper which he cut out and sent it to Srila Prabhupada. It was in German. No one there spoke German. But Prabhupada looked at the text and saw that A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada or something along those lines was there. He said, I know you're going to be successful because you're remembering your spiritual master. So if someone has that sincerity to feel that, what do I know? Whatever I know is what's been revealed to me through my spiritual master, then that kind of faith will actually lead to empowered speaking. Yasya Devi Parabhakti Yata Devi Tataguru Tasyate Katita Hyata Prakashante Mahatmana. Unto those great souls with implicit faith in the spiritual master and Krishna, all the imports of Vedic knowledge are automatically revealed. Srila Prabhupada even goes as far as to say in one purport, I think 10.10 in Bhagavad Gita, even if the disciple's not smart enough to take full advantage of what the spiritual master's saying, if he's sincere, Krishna will guide him from within. So even there may be some intellectual shortage, that is no impediment if that spirit is there of sincere and faithful following. It's a revealed process. It's descending. It's not that through our intellects, our cunning strategies, we will master, how to convey Krishna consciousness to the masses. It's the mercy of Guru and Krishna.
And sort of a further inquiry into sometimes some devotees are referred to as fanatical, okay? They just stay by the book, whereas other people are more into welcoming new people so as they can join gradually by taking prasad, by hearing to some degree and doing service for Krishna to whatever degree of faith they might have. Then eventually they become devotees. So there's a little bit of difference there, isn't it? But we have had a few fanatical, I say that with inverted commas, devotees, but they kind of get slandered for that. They stand by Prabhupada with complete faith in those words, and sometimes they have effect, but not on everyone, of course.
And we hear from Srila Rupa Goswami, niyama agraha, niyama agraha. So being overly rigid, and we've met those devotees who it's about the rule book, and they actually enjoy disapproving of people all day long, and almost painfully hitting people with the rule book as if that's a jolly that they're getting out of it. And then on the other hand, you've got someone who completely disregards the rules. Both are unfavorable for bhakti, according to Srila Rupa Goswami. So I don't mean to use an anti-intellectual argument. We should use our intelligence to think about how do I convey the message in a way that makes it so accessible, so relevant, and yes, appealing, which could include the timing. When do I let people know about the 4 restrictions? Maybe it's not in the first conversation. Maybe I wait until they've got a little attachment to chanting Hare Krishna. So all of those things are bona fide. But if we're using our intelligence to go, this point that Prabhupada makes just rails. I don't want to defend it. I'll throw Prabhupada under the bus. I think he was making it up at this point. What? They'll use cleverer words, right? But in essence, that's the unfortunate.
Lack of faith. They're just revealing their lack of faith. That's just revealing one's lack of faith.
Lack of faith.
In Guru.
Lack of faith. I'm mindful that we've gone slightly over, so I don't want to be in the Atta Sampradaya. Oh, Prabhuji, you have a license to speak whenever you like.
Thank you for the. I hope you don't mind going over a little bit of time. Just that my question is about scientists. We seem to have a blanket criticism of scientists full stop at times. But there is all types of scientists. There's even theistic scientists, there's scientists that develop medicine that help us. So when we criticise scientists, is it a particular aspect of science that we're criticising, or the scientist is quite a broad term? Yeah.
That's a great point. And Srila Prabhupada even used the word science. Science simply means, as a Greek word, means to know. So it's a process more often than not of learning things by a combination of direct perception, experimentation, inference, and so on. They are legitimate forms of acquiring certain knowledge. They just have limits. And I think Srila Prabhupada's main objection is where they overstepped and started to teach something as fact, which in fact had not even been exposed to their own espoused practices. No, I think there's actually a lot of value, and I wouldn't say that we're anti-science. In fact, arguably, we're trying to hold the scientists accountable to practice what they preach. So don't tell us there was a Big Bang. Redshift. The universe is expanding. We have an alternative hypothesis for how the universe might be expanding. It doesn't mean it had to have blown up one day. So admit your limitations. That would be probably the thing that we're saying. But, you know, much of what science is doing is creating facilities. I'm using a computer here. It helped me make a few notes that, you know, supported my ailing mind. It's a handy device, and it can be used in Krishna's service. So we don't reject anything which could be used in Krishna's service, but we're careful. And I would say, particularly if we're exposed to doctrines whose ultimate conclusion is nihilism, voidism, then we have to be very careful. Mayavadi Basha Shunile Hoy Savanas. We see sometimes, there's a devotee, I just saw one of his threads recently, he was posting pictures from the moon, from some Chinese landing that's going on there at the moment. Interestingly, they're bringing back some more rocks for the first time in 45 years. We're getting some moon rocks. But I'm pretty sure I heard the first lot of moon rocks have been debunked, and now they've all gone missing, as has much of the video footage from NASA. So Srila Prabhupada was really clear. He doubted it because he had his firm faith in how Chandra Loka is described in the Vedic scriptures. And there were times he might even concede, well, maybe there was some way that they experienced something, but they certainly haven't encountered Chandra Loka. So ultimately it comes down to who we're going to put our faith in. Srila Prabhupada certainly challenges a lot of, you know, beliefs, whether that's social structuring kind of ideas or the shape of the universe. But let's really look at just how much do we know. If we think about it realistically, we're sitting on a little rock, occasionally sending a probe out into space and looking through a sophisticated telescope that we've got. And we're claiming to know dimensions of the universe, age of the universe, origins of the universe. Really? I take it with a pinch of salt myself. I can't claim to have first-hand knowledge either way. But I'd much rather put my faith in Prabhupada's descriptions of these things. Even while acknowledging there are times Prabhupada would leave some room that the scientists may have some merit to what they're doing. I don't know if that addressed your question, Prabhuji. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.